Here we go.
Here we go. Actually, if you guys can hang with us for 1 second. God, I pray for Cortney over these next 20 minutes, that you will calm her and that you will give her the confidence that she needs, that you will give her the words to speak this evening, and that she will just feel your presence with her.
And Father God, I pray for this, the most courageous man that I know, and I'm so blessed to be up here standing with him and sharing her story. Amen.
All right, we're back. Thanks. All right, so my name is Marc. This is my wife, Cortney. Some of you may recognize me. I was here a couple months ago kind of sharing my story. For those of you that weren't there, I'm going to try and compress a 22-minute talk into about 90 seconds. So hang on tight. I was born in Syracuse, New York, raised in a Christian home. In high school, was very involved in my youth group, very involved in Young Life, got to college, same kind of thing, volunteer Young Life leader, heavily involved in my church. We got married, we led Bible studies, small groups. Christianity was really my identity. It was what defined me, and I grew to a point where I really liked that identity. I liked people seeing me as Joe Christian, the kid with a good head on his shoulders, the kid that's going places, the kid that just relies on God. And I got to the point where I liked it enough that anything that would detract from that, I kept secret. And I wouldn't let people know about anything that didn't portray me in that Christian light. Which with little things was okay, but as I got out of college, I started hiding more and more things. And the big thing I hid was some pretty heavy pornography use. And that pornography use started small, and it grew, and it eventually led to several acts of adultery. It led to heavy use for 13 years, where I was in a pretty dark place, basically leading two lives, and finally came to the realization that through the help of a counselor, that I was a full-blown sex addict. So all that came out about 4 years ago is when Cortney learned about it, and it came out over a 9-day period, of time. And in those 9 days, I had to admit to the two most important people in my life at the time that I had made some really bad choices, and that we really had to, well, first of all, those two people are standing up here on the stage. I had to admit it to her, but I also had to admit it to me, because I was in pretty heavy denial that I was doing any of this, that any of this stuff was really me, because I was still soaked up in this public persona. And so we both had to struggle and grapple with, who is this person that I have been hiding for so long?
So it's about at this point that people start to glance over at me and wonder what's going through my mind, why we're standing up here together. Many people have asked why I stayed with Marc. Those who haven't directly verbalized it have certainly done so with their stares or their body language. When Marc first shared his story at our church at the time, it was up on the big screen as part of the pastor's sermon. And then a few weeks later, when I spoke for the first time at the church, several people approached me afterwards and said that they were so glad to hear my perspective, because when they heard only Marc's, it was really hard to imagine who the wife was on the other side of this, and why there was still a wife on the other side of this. Most people tend to instinctively believe that in this situation, they would separate or divorce. The truth is, I had believed that too. And I came close, very close, many times, to walking out the door, or at least locking Marc out. I'll never forget the first days, weeks, and months of this story. And I try really hard not to downplay the raw hurt and just the utter anguish that I experienced when Marc started to reveal this double life. Downplaying it would mean that I wasn't being authentic. And I just can't risk that now. Neither of us can. Authenticity is critical to our redemption. I can still picture snippets of time as if I'm looking at myself or watching from afar, as I and we struggled through this reveal process of his addiction. I spent a lot of time on the floor, in secret, in the dark, curled up in a ball, not sure if I would survive the pain. There were several defining moments. I call them God moments, where I specifically heard or felt God's voice or presence. And I want to talk about 2 tonight, but I've written about others as devotionals or included them in my book. On night 3 of this 9-day reveal process, after Marc had told me about yet another secret of his past, I ran up to our bedroom, I shut the door, and I broke. I crawled into bed, and I pulled out my Bible, not because I had a long history of a deep dependence on God, and not because at the time I was absolutely positive that God was right there with me. But it was all I had left. So I opened up to the Psalms and cried all over them, looking for something that might be relevant. That's when I heard him. Don't leave yet. I knew it was God the instant that I heard those words. They were calm, and I certainly wasn't. They were filled with empathy and love, and I was feeling no empathy or love at that moment. You know, there's an immense amount of shame in this story. I knew that unless someone had been right where I was sitting, that they wouldn't understand. And so I didn't feel like I could call anyone. There's a lot of loneliness, and I felt like everyone had been taken off the list because they just wouldn't understand. I didn't know what else to do, but in that moment when I felt God say, "Don't leave yet," I held on to that word "yet." God was giving me a choice, and it would be a decision I could always change. But I was also very aware of what God wasn't saying with words, but I still knew to be true. He was somehow going to make this good. He was about to do something amazing. All I had to do was trust him. I chose to do just that on my bed that night. I don't think I had ever relinquished something so important and so scary in my life. But I chose to do so that night. I chose to give up what I really wanted to do, which was leave. And it was about to get real and messy. But I chose to follow Jesus down the road, the hard road, simply because, 1, he asked. And 2, I realized that he is always good, and no one else is good all the time. The second moment that I pray I never forget happened earlier in the day, on that day 3. I had hid away in the closed-off section of our master bathroom, the one where the toilet is. I had shut all the doors. I was on the floor again, curled up in a ball, just sobbing. I kept unrolling more and more toilet paper, trying to soak up my tears. As I did, I sensed God telling me something. It's hard to explain, but in that moment, I just knew that I was going to share this story with thousands. I had no idea if the ending would include Marc. I didn't know if we'd still be married or even speaking to each other. All I knew was that God was working to make this good, to redeem this. He was asking me to boldly share the story before I had even gone through it. And in some strange way, that gave me comfort. I think it was because when you feel that you can help redeem others' messy stories, it actually works to redeem your own. If just one person could find God or grow more intimate with Christ because of this, despite the awful pain, would it be worth it? So if you're one of those who had glanced over at me while Marc had revealed why we're up here, those are just a couple of the reasons, but I think they're pretty good ones.
All right, so we get a lot of questions. We get a lot of questions surrounding, why would you go public with this? I mean, let's face it, this isn't the easiest thing to admit or to talk about. What if people look at you differently? What if people don't want to be around you? What if people don't want to be your friends anymore? What if your kids' friends' parents don't want your kids playing together anymore? What if your boss finds out? There's a lot of what ifs out there. And I've got a couple answers for that. One kind of high level. I spent 36 years of my life trying to manipulate other people and worried what other people were going to think of me and only letting the good things out. And it didn't land me in a very good spot. And so if I continued with that mindset, would I have learned anything? Had I learned anything? I don't think I would have. Secondly, why go public? Early in my recovery stage, I read a book, and it said that was given to me by my counselor, and it said that the most encouraging words in the English language are "me too." And in my head, I thought, you know what? I can't change anything about what happened. If I could, I would, but I can't change anything. So, to Court's point, if we can share it and say, hey, we've been there and can help others, why not use it? And then finally, all this came out in September 4 years ago. So then a year and a couple months later, leading up to Christmas, I was sitting in church, and our pastor was going through his pre-Christmas series, and it was on he was focusing on Mary, the mother of Jesus. And he was reading the passage where Mary and the angel are having the conversation about, you're going to bear a child, you're going to name him Jesus. And our pastor pointed out, at any point during that time, Mary could have said no. God doesn't force us to do anything. He didn't force Mary to do this. Mary had the option to say, no, I'm not up for this. But she knew that by saying yes, one, she was stepping into God's plan for her, but she risked being divorced, probably being disowned by her family, being a single mom at that time, which would probably lead to being a social outcast and thrown out of her community. And I sat there in church, and I just felt God talking to me, saying, you know what? Welcome to your Mary moment. Are you going to say yes and risk all those things because they're all possible? Or are you going to say no and hide? And so 2 months later, as Court alluded to, my face was up on screens a lot like this in our church, sharing my story. And a week later, we were both talking in the youth group at our church saying, hey, this is a warning. This stuff's dangerous. This is what we've been through. Please learn from us.
So what is the message here? I think there are several, but the one that we want to touch on tonight is that we believe God designed marriage. We believe it is the most intimate of all human relationships. When the Bible says, and the two will become one flesh, we sense the significance of that, the magnitude of that. We also believe it's historically the building block of all society. So if marriage is by God's design, and it was created first and as the most important relationship for us, it would make perfect sense that Satan would try to destroy it. This is where my passion lies. As more and more people approach us with similar stories and circumstances, I get pissed. I see it as direct evidence of the devil's involvement. Some people judge what I'm about to say next, or at the very least don't understand it, and that's okay. I don't get angry with the addict. While I know Marc had choices throughout our marriage, and he obviously chose poorly on many occasions, and while I know that he's a recovering addict because of those choices, I don't put all the blame on him. I think this is one of the critical ideas that has allowed me to truly absolve him and everyone else involved, and to move through our recovery without becoming a bitter or resentful or paranoid wife, which would be so easy to do. Much of the blame I assign to our story falls on the shoulders of our true enemy. I believe Satan has specific plans for each of us. I believe that they are molded and crafted to suit our particular histories, backgrounds, personalities, weaknesses, and buttons. Many months, and I mean many months into our recovery, once I realized that Marc was not my enemy and Satan was, I was able to look at him with fresh eyes. I was able to see him as the man God created him to be, and as the husband he so desperately wanted to be. At that point, Marc and I were at least on one page together. We have watched marriage after marriage implode due to addiction or infidelity. Our goal is not to convince people to stay in marriages that are not safe. Please hear me on that. God asked me to stay, I think in part because he knew he was working overtime on Marc's heart, and he knew that Marc was going to choose to respond. Our goal is to open the eyes of those who are married and those who want to be married someday, and just bring to light this particular pitfall. It's related to the availability of pornography, and it's related to the enemy seeking to destroy marriage, particularly through the spiritual leader of the family. I'm so tired of Satan's schemes. So while statistics, books, research, anecdotal stories tell us that we should not be happily married after this type of blow, well, we want to say, in the words of Miss Clara in the movie War Room, if you've seen it, "Devil, you just got your butt kicked."
So, Court alluded to the attack of the spiritual leader, and guess who that was? We both feel that that my role, the man's role in our marriage, is to be the spiritual leader. And for a long time, I was not doing a good job there, really because I couldn't. I was too busy hiding. In the last few years, there have been. I have put things in place for me to help me fulfill that role much better. The first thing I've done is what I call set up my defense. There's a TED Talk by Johann Hari that you can check out on YouTube or TED.com, and he talks about addiction and our perception of addiction. And addicts by nature like to seclude themselves and isolate themselves and keep people at an arm's length because they don't want anyone finding out what they're doing and what's going on and the trouble that they're in. And so Johann says at the end of his talk that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And so to keep my defense up, to keep me from falling back into the addictive behaviors, I make sure that I'm involved in as many communities as I can be. I'm engaged with people as often as I can be, which is really difficult for me because I'm an introvert by nature. But I have to force myself to be in communities especially communities that know my story, and that I've given permission to say, hey, how are you doing today? And don't lie to me. Other things that we've put in place, every night I pray with Court. Every night it's my responsibility to initiate prayer with Court. There are some nights I don't do it because I'm tired or I just don't want to, but it's my responsibility and it's on me to initiate that with her. Next is every morning I pray for her. On my own, I get up much earlier than she does to either exercise or get to work, and I'm usually out the door before she ever wakes up. But before I leave, I spend 5 minutes just praying for her. praying for her, just what she has that day. And I found that to be very valuable. One, it's asking God to just be with her. But it also, I can't pray for her that day if I don't know what she has going on that day. It's easy to pray for big picture things. It's hard to pray, hey, help her have a good dentist appointment today. Like, I have to know her schedule. I have to be much more engaged than I used to be able to pray specifically for what she has on that day. And then finally, I ask myself 2 questions every day. And they're 2 questions that a spiritual leader gave me and who I respect hugely. And the 2 questions are simply, what's God asking you to do? And secondly, what are you going to do about it? And really, if I can answer those 2 questions positively every day, I'm gonna be okay.
So our story is about marriage and God's ability for us to live apart from the world's expectations surrounding divorce and addiction. You know, the world isn't going to be on your side when you're truly obedient to God. I felt like I was swimming upstream most of the time, being criticized, misunderstood, and judged for trying to work this out. I learned to make decisions for an audience of 1. But you know, this doesn't have to only be about marriage redemption. It does have to be about breaking the cycle of whatever it is that the enemy has on you and finding freedom and peace in God. Thank you so much.